cannonball off the porch side. Older kids trying off the roof. Just the same way you showed me you were sure.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Natasha and I'm a senior at Harker.
Hey everyone, I'm Ethan and I'm also a senior.
Everyone, I'm Kris and I am a sophomore. Today, the Youth Activism Club and the Student Diversity Coalition are hosting this important conversation on anti-Asian discrimination with Assemblymember Alex Lee. As we celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month this May, recognizing the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and how they have enriched our nation's history, we must also address the recent rise in anti-Asian discrimination. Over the past year, hate incidents against Asian Americans have skyrocketed across our nation and in the Bay Area, totaling to over 3,800, according to StopAAPIHate.
We also want to recognize the deep pain that these hate incidents have caused, not only for the countless victims and their families, but for the Asian American community writ large. It is heartbreaking to see news articles after news article about the brutal attacks against Asian Americans, people who look like us. You might have found yourself thinking, that could have been a family member or a friend or even yourself. Especially for young Asian Americans, many of whom make up our student body, this issue is one that must be addressed. As a school community, we must come together to condemn the targeting of Asian Americans and support our AAPI classmates and faculty. That is why we hope this assembly will help spark a conversation that you will carry on long after today.
So joining us now is Assemblymember Alex Lee, who is the state assembly member representing the 25th district, which encompasses Santa Clara, Fremont, Milpitas, and North San Jose. Assemblymember Lee is a Democrat who serves on the Assembly committees on budget, education, privacy and consumer protections, and transportation. His priorities include fighting for affordable housing, healthcare for all, and reinvesting in schools and social services.
Before his election last November, he served as a legislative policy advisor in the California State Senate and Assembly. His family immigrated to California from Hong Kong, and he graduated from UC Davis with a degree in political science and communications. In 2020, he made history as the first Gen Z, youngest Asian American, and first bisexual state legislator in California history. Assemblymember Lee, thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on your recent election to the California Assembly. Before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into politics?
Hey, yeah, well, I'm really glad to be invited here and talk to everyone at Harker. My name is Assemblymember Alex Lee. I represent the 25th Assembly District, which comprises of the cities of North San Jose, Santa Clara, Milpitas, Fremont, and Newark. I also, at the age of 25, represent the 25th Assembly District. So I am right now currently half the average age of the state legislature. So it's a great honor to be able to represent my hometown where I grew up. I grew up in North San Jose and Milpitas. So if you live also anywhere near those areas, I'm probably your state representative. Also with me right now is my cat Soba, who loves to be on camera with me. So she's gonna pop in. But you know, a great sense of why it's important to get into politics and get into government, or really just be active in your community one way or the other, is because our generation and the generations after us have the unique responsibility of inheriting a lot of big crises that were not of our doing. Whether you're talking about climate change or wealth inequality or housing inequality, those things were not of our creation, but certainly those are things we must fix, or else we have to live their entire lives with them and a world that would be even worse with them. So it's important to always ask yourself, if not you, then who? And that's why you should rise to the challenge and serve your community.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Lee. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion of today's event. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function to submit them. But to start off, what are your thoughts on the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes?
Well, certainly, you know, the resurgence of anti-Asian racism is nothing new to this country. Ever since the very beginning, you know, the first Asian Americans or Asian folk people who came to America, they were met with hostility, were met with racism. And even in California, if you remember, even though sometimes there's a reputation of being blue, liberal, whatever it is, you know, this is the state that originated a lot of the worst anti-Asian laws that existed. So, you know, I'm reminded every day when I go to the state capitol, that is a place where for generations, lawmakers sat idly as well, or in fact, they kind of pushed it, anti-Asian laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the, well, a lot of laws that barred immigration. Obviously, they also stood idle as Japanese internment also happened in this state. So a lot of terrible things happen, right? But this is not unique. So the moment we're living in is not unique. It is a continuation of it. And certainly a lot of Asian Americans, certainly like my family, that were able to immigrate to America after the civil rights era, that opened the doors for a lot more inclusive immigration. We might not have the historic context, right? Certainly there are some Asian Americans who live even in my district who have been here for generations and generations. And they remember, what it was like in the 30s or the 1880s even. But for a lot of recent immigrants, sometimes that history is disconnected. But for the racists, right, for the people who perpetuate this racism, that history is not disconnected for them. They see us all as the same, and they treat us all as the same. And unfortunately, it's a continuation, right? But I think, why it's especially pronounced nowadays, right, is because we, for the last couple of years, had people in government who very much validated things like the Chinese flu, Kung flu, all these things, and they were perpetuating a lot of stereotypes, right? So what began as a lot of fear about a pandemic, obviously very xenophobic fears about a pandemic, then morphed into more and more ugly parts. And you see this kind of hate rising amongst all people of color and all marginalized communities right now. We're living in really tough times, and that's because when you let hate be validated and you let it go unchallenged and fester in power, it will grow and grow and grow. And that's what's unfortunately happening right now. And we are still living through the aftermath of all that. And we have to take a lot of time to undo it, right? And I think largely what we have to challenge ourselves is it's important one thing to say we need to stop racism and we need to confront it. But then the question becomes, what then? What do you do about that? How do you dismantle racism from your systems? How do you dismantle it from our education systems, from our justice system, from our legal codes? And that takes a lot of work to confront the historic inequities, right? And that's the kind of work I'm doing in the state capitol. And even though sometimes it's not apparent how economics or education play into racism, those have been the tools to uphold racism, right? Because it's a lot easier to validate people based on their race than also using the same economic tools to cudgel them to. So what we're experiencing is kind of a resurgence of what has always historically been the case. But I think it's a great chance for us to mobilize and to organize to really tear down a lot of institutional racism that exists already.
Thank you. So next question we have is, how have you seen the anti-Asian hate crimes affect the Asian community?
Yeah, I mean, so in the 25th Assembly District that I represent, it is a majority Asian community. It's one of the few districts in the state that actually has a majority of Asian Americans, but it is. And I, probably as most people can imagine, it causes a lot of fear and anxiety about everything that's going on. There's a lot of things get blown up in the headlines and a lot of misconceptions that happen too, but it's like we are certainly living in a time that is very tumultuous and a lot of fears out there. But a lot of people also genuinely are asking us, what can we do? What can we do to confront these issues and how can we stop them so prevent them from happening anymore? And I think in my community, I'm blessed to have a lot of Asian Americans and to have that kind of dialogue, because I don't think there has ever been a strong progressive voice in talking about how do we dismantle racism in our systems rather than slapping on old, redoubling down on old ways that have not worked, because it's important that even now, especially if you hold values that are more progressive instead of regressive, you have to speak out as an Asian American and offer solutions, because for too long we've had outsiders from our community give us solutions that don't actually work. So it's a lot of members of our community are really hurting right now, but I think there's a lot of energy to mobilize for change, and we see that in a lot of rallies and actions that are happening. In fact, people are getting behind more criminal justice reform issues too. I think it's important to use this as a rallying point in time.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what sort of government policies do you think can combat anti-Asian hate, and what is the state government doing to address this issue?
Yeah, the state is doing quite a bit right now. And I guess I can talk about in the same vein of what should be done. Really important is to obviously have inclusive education that includes ethnic studies and really understanding the history of our country and our people. For too long, I think history is obviously taught as just American history in general too. It's very Eurocentric, American-centric, white-centric, right? And then all the people of color that exist in this country, including the people that already were here before the white people, are become an afterthought, and they become this idea that's ethnic studies, right? But we have to really integrate that into the holistic study of our culture and our history, and that provides a great understanding. And that is also efforts we're working on right now in the budget process and in bills we're working on to get ethnic studies. But also why it's important is if you think about, sometimes I think the very like abridged story of civil rights and racism in this country is that racism was really bad. There's a lot of slavery and bad things. And then Martin Luther King came and Obama came and then racism was over, right? And that was the very simple way it was taught without teaching why it was important all that bad stuff happened and then what progress was made. Certainly there was progress, but it was not solved. And sometimes I think it gets too abridged that way. So education is really important, right? Other things we're working on right now is also making sure that there is an actual objective hotline to report hate crime incidences or hate incidences. And this obviously expands to obviously more than just Asian Americans, but because right now there is actually no, no state sanctioned way to report hate crimes. There's a lot of great nonprofits out there, like you've probably seen AAPI Hate that catalog hate incidences, but obviously that is not technically official and it's just based on the sampling and what people give them. And it's still a lot of hate incidents, right? But there could be actually a lot more out there. So we're going to have a process where people can actually report them and we have a better sense of what's going on. And then at the same time, we are also, I'm really committed with, especially with my API legislative caucus colleagues, to uplift the economic conditions for all, because too long, socioeconomic conditions that have oppressed a lot of people lead to a lot of the bad behaviors and people acting out as we see it. And if we can really stem that, I think it'll be the majority of it. And then over time, if we lead with love and educate people, hopefully we will get racism out of the way as well. It's just an attitudinal thing. And I think it's just, a lot of exposure and education to sort out racism too.
You mentioned changes in altering education and how we teach history. Is there a push for that right now? And what are some ways schools can start right now, and especially through administrative actions, to bring in Asian American history into the curriculum?
Yeah, there is an effort right now. There is a bill by Assemblymember Medina for ethnic studies. I believe it is Assembly Bill 101. I might get the numbers all wrong, but there is that push right now to get ethnic studies as a graduation requirement in schools. But there is also nothing that prevents schools from voluntarily creating cultural studies or something like that of the sort at their school sites right now and teaching a more holistic history. So, if students and parents and community members and even teachers want to do that at their schools, I think they can advocate for that and create that kind of curriculum. It's all very possible.
Thank you. So next question is, do you believe that the recent anti-Asian hate crimes are linked primarily with white supremacy, or are there growing anti-Asian sentiments across other ethnic communities?
Oh yeah, of course it's tied to white supremacy. This country was quite literally founded with white supremacy in mind, and that is not an inflammatory statement. If you look back in history, literally it's how it's built. So I mean, look, it's deep rooted in this way, and being anti-Asian or upholding even the model minority stereotypes and stuff is white supremacy in action. There are going to be a lot of folks, especially who, one way or the other, if they uphold white supremacy consciously or subconsciously, would love to see Asian Americans divided amongst other communities of color, right? So, because it's a classic divide and conquer kind of strategy to make communities of color fear each other, to not trust each other. So I don't think it's any sort of like, one community pit against the other, but there are folks who certainly feel that, the white way is the right way. And, there's folks, unfortunately, even in the Asian American community that feel assimilation is the way to go, right? Rather than having a kind of melting pot strategy or a melting pot kind of fabric of society. So there is those kind of tendencies that exist in our society, unfortunately. And what we're seeing today is still upholding, right? Because you've probably seen this when, when we had a president that would say, oh, it's a Chinese flu, it's Kung flu, you'd be afraid of Chinese people. And, people say like you eat pangolins or something, when the pandemic was really, really starting and it's still happening now. That's a product of white supremacy, whether or not it comes from a white person or an Asian person or someone of another race who says those things. Those are products of it. And we have to acknowledge that white supremacy can exist in so many different vessels, whether they be institutional things like in banking and in laws, or in people of all races, unfortunately.
How do you think the American media could help with not perpetrating harmful misconceptions or stereotypes about like Asian Americans?
Yeah, that's a good question. How can the media not? One of the biggest things you think about is how do problematic views gain a foothold in our society, right? You find something that is acceptable to talk about, largely, and then you kind of couch it in the same terms. We see this when it comes to transphobia, when homophobia. I won't go with examples, but you can probably just imagine where those examples come, right? To get a foothold, and then they use to talk about it. I think in the foothold of Asian American hatred, and the media often portrays, right, is well, one, constant hostility towards the People's Republic of China, and you conflate it later on to Chinese people, or things that happen in Asia. You talk about how they're criticized the third world, or you talk about the pandemic. There's a lot of ways that I think we can talk about diseases or structural inequalities, or even government inequalities or human rights abuses, without it becoming a race thing. And sometimes the media kind of loses that. You know, the very classic debate that early on was like, why can you not call something the Chinese flu if it originated in China, rather than, you know, calling it actual disease? And, you know, that was a conversation we had a year ago about, right? And then why just that toehold of racism basically lets everything else happen, and it's those things. So they have to, the media, I think, has to be very responsible and very cognizant of the connotations they put. But sometimes, you know, in the media today, it's very much clickbait and headline based. So sometimes if it's more inflammatory, the more it does, right? And that's the unfortunate byproduct in our echo chambers right now.
Going back to the legislative arena, how intertwined is classism with anti-Asian racism, and how can progressive policies combat both?
It's super entwined. Look, I always approach progressivism as about, even, and this is historic context, right? Because the progressive movement actually started more than 100 years ago, and it also was very much originated with the Republican Party of the time. Obviously, the party is very different nowadays. But, you know, progressivism, I view it as this, right? It's fighting for people who historically have very little power and uplifting them, while regressivism or conservatism is about protecting people who have a lot of power, and how do you listen to them, right? So you have very different viewpoints in government that way, and how the role of government in that sense. So when we talk about ending racism or uplifting communities of color or marginalized communities of any sort, that is progressive, because you are taking resources or power and redistributing to people who historically don't. And if you look at the history of Asian Americans, we historically have had very little power until recently, with a lot of new immigration and a lot of people who have like great skills and great income, and that's fantastic. But there also is not always a picture of the entire picture of Asian Americans, right? Because there are cultural groups within the Asian American diaspora that obviously not do very well economically or socioeconomically, and we have to be uplifting everyone together, and we can't paint everyone with a broad brush all the time like that. So it's important to constantly be talking about, you know, who has the means to give back to their communities and who doesn't, right? And how do we meet in the middle that way? And that always brings us into the realm of economics, into criminal justice, into education. And so it's not all about like, well, it's just me, this is for me, and I want to do it for my family, but like, how do you do it for the broader community? And sometimes, unfortunately, that kind of conversation has to happen amongst Asian American communities too, is saying, how can we help uplift the general conditions of everyone in the society, because that makes it safer and more prosperous for everyone, including them.
So next, is there a way to address the anti-Asian hate crimes with legislation that wouldn't also increase police enforcement and potentially police brutality?
It's a fantastic question, Kris. Yes, there's fantastic ways to do that. And I will just say, you know, that was kind of what I was alluding to, is there historically, when bad things happen to the Asian American community or a lot of communities who are marginalized, you have people in power who traditionally, historically, have not looked anything like those communities, and they say, hey, if we're tough on crime, we do these things because you have real fears and anxieties, this will solve all your issues. We'll do it all. And that historically has been happening even since when I was born in the 90s. You know, that was kind of the zenith of the tough on crime era. Is we have a lot of solutions that don't work. They're false bill of goods, and they get sold to us from other people who are outside the community. It still happens today, and I think they really prey upon the fears of our Asian American community. And it's important to note that the policies that have led to over incarceration, to police brutality, you know, make us an outlier in the developed world. We have, 5% of the entire population in the world, but 25% of the entire incarcerated population. It costs the taxpayers billions of dollars. It doesn't make us any safer, and yet we keep doubling down on those issue areas because in the moment it feels good. It feels nice, right? Because revenge in the moment when someone has always feels good, but we know long term that doesn't produce any results that make us any safer. So we always are working on legislation. I'm actually carrying a bill of the same sort too, to dismantle the system, because even those even Asian Americans get swept up in the system too of over incarceration. That's often not talked about, but there are also people who get, victimized by an over punitive system. And that is important to distinguish, because there will be a lot of people who say, the key to solving anti-Asian hate crime is like you just lock away more and more people. Maybe in an extent it's true. If everyone is in jail, I guess no one would be committing hate crimes to each other. But there are those people who just want to throw people in prison and throw away the key. And that's not the way to do it, because that is upholding the same systems of racism and institutional racism that led us here. So we have to be really working on conditions that uplift everyone, and that comes through education, comes through socioeconomic measures, because ultimately a lot of things we see and frustrations that are happening are byproducts of a larger social failing, right? And that's always sometimes hard to articulate for people, right? But if you're poor and you're desperate, sometimes you'll act out in ways that are not desirable. But I don't think sometimes that was meant to be. There's always destined in the fate of that person. It's like if we invested better in housing and clean water and food and education for everyone, we would probably have a lot safer society. I bet you that. And we'd probably see a lot less hate crimes in general. Would racism and these isms that still exist because people are, uneducated, or people are not educated about these issues or just not tolerant still exist? It could still exist, but I would say a lot of the discontent that foments in the massive society would gone.
You mentioned before that some communities within the Asian American community face more challenges than others. What is the model minority myth, and how does it influence our society and also relate to the gap within the Asian community?
Yeah, essentially, to boil it down, is the model minority myth is essentially that Asian Americans are the model minority, as in they are the minority population that every other minority in America should look up to. They came here, they didn't complain about racism, they were financially and economically successful, and they listened to our white supremacist American values, so you should do like them. You should stop complaining, you should do that stuff, right? And the model minority myth is that, a myth, because it is used to perpetuate racism and it used to wedge us against other communities of color, where, in fact, if you look at it, we have more things in common with oppressed communities of color and marginalized communities than not. And it's always going to be used as a wedge issue. And you see this historical play out over and over again throughout history, where you find new populations to wedge other people against. And that's why it's really unfortunate. So there are populations, especially those from Southeast Asia, which have a different historical path of getting to America through war and through a lot of terrible things, that do not reflect the same path of, say, high-skilled, high-income earner migrant that came from East Asia. It's not exactly the same experience for sure, but every population, every diaspora has different needs, right? And to paint them all as, say, we all are like the Chinese population, or we're all like the Indian community, it's not the same, or it's not accurate to do so, and that really leaves people out in really tangible ways. Like, a way I think about it is in government, right? Especially in our area, if you think about just in the realm of the pandemic, if you only did culturally sensitive outreach with testing or vaccination, and you only did it to the Chinese community because you assume that the Asian community is just the Chinese community or something, then obviously you leave out entire swaths of community, and especially communities that need help most sometimes, that are struggling socioeconomically. So those are the kind of ways that broad brushing us and upholding model minority really hurts people in real tangible ways.
Talked about the shared experience of racism that a lot of communities, not just the Asian American community, experience. How do you think we can go about confronting anti-Asian sentiment without decreasing the awareness of other racial equality movements like Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I think a lot of activists and a lot of organizers have been very cognizant of this, especially if you're looking at the reimagining side and dismantling racism angle, that all our fights are intertwined. I see a lot of solidarity between, BLM organizers from Latino community, all those people, everyone who is organizing in this space, I think senses that solidarity. But it's important to remember that, especially if you're an Asian American and you're very fearful and anxious about the time that's happening right now, is remembering that this is a similar vote to every other marginalized community. It's not something that's exceptional to us. I think sometimes it gets lost in the nuance that Asian American hate crimes are not like in isolation. It's not like we're the only folks that are being hurt right now. It's obviously true that we're more in the spotlight than usual, but we're not the only ones, right? There's still As police brutality, there still is a lot of racism, there's still deportations, and then also against Asian Americans too, there's deportations. There's still lots and lots of ugly things. And in this moment where perhaps racism did not feel so true and personal to you, now it is. But remember that that experience you're feeling right now is also true for every other person of color or marginalized community that exists in this country as well. And I think that awakening moment and understanding that will breed greater solidarity.
Another question from the audience: how has your being queer affected your political aspirations? What is it like being a member of the LGBTQ plus community in politics? And how can more people from this community get involved in politics?
Yeah, I mean, when I was elected last year, I got the honor of being the first openly bisexual state legislator, and I thought I wasn't the first, honestly. I thought someone else had already gotten there in 2020. In 2020, I thought someone already had beat me to it. But it just shows the lack of diversity and lack of representation that still exists in all levels of government, is that queer people often do not have all the representation. And that's also important, I think, as a queer person of color, to remember that all our lives are intersectional. We're not one issue, we're not one identity constantly. While there are certainly people that are racist that want to pigeonhole us as one thing all our lives, we live many different lives, right? Or many different aspects of our lives. And I think being queer and being Asian American helps me understand, at least on a personal level, that all our fights are intersectional, right? The fight for equal rights has always been ugly as well in this country, as so is the equal rights when it's based on race as well as sexual orientation, right? So there's still a lot of, I think in California, we're lucky that there's a lot less, I don't know what the term for maybe is biphobia, but like homophobia in general, like a lot of phobia against the community has abated and kind of been squashed kind of to the dark areas of society where racism used to be. But unfortunately, we still have a lot of work to do nationally as well as the state, and making sure that people are recognized. We still have to make sure that trans lives are respected, and there's still a lot of work to be done, even in California. And we have to make sure that the very simple fact that people should not live in fear of who they choose to love. That still exists as a problem over here.
We have another question regarding your political engagement. What kinds of activities were you involved with in high school and college that led to you to your roles in politics?
In high school, I actually did very little. I'm gonna admit that. I didn't do very much. I was part of a couple of clubs and stuff, but when I went to college and I got into UC Davis at the time. So I applied as political science, and actually I was choosing between political science and like film studies or something, because I really like movie making and the film industry too. And it's hard. Both politics and filmmaking are about telling stories and working together as a team with people with different talents. So I still carry over that same mentality to everything I do. But in college, I was I figured that because I was so apathetic in high school, essentially, that I should probably get more involved in the school that I chose to go to. So I was a club president there too. So I ran some clubs and stuff too. And then I ran it and was a student senator. Then I was student president over there at Davis. So I represented like nearly 30,000 students. And that was my first kind of small experience of being elected official. And I think it's invaluable. Like if you can ever do any leadership roles in school and college and whatever capacity, it's so invaluable because you really learn the basics and fundamentals of working together with other people. And sometimes in elected office today with people who are maybe thrice my age, I still don't see that same skills you learn. And I think it's through experiences like this early on, you understand how to work with people, right? Because the worst thing, every student has an experience, right? If you're in a group project and there's someone that does all the work and someone that does none of the work, that dynamic still exists in government, and you do not want to be the person that does no work. And it just kind of is what is it called? The social sleuth or something? Social sloth, it's called. But you don't want to be that person. You want to be in a space where you also don't want to be the person that just does all the work too. You want it to be a collaborative team effort, because democracy ultimately is a team sport. And if you have some people that do all the work, could be good, could also be terrible. And if you have a lot of people that don't do the work, that's could always be terrible. So it's really important to build your foundational skills now, how to work with other people, how to work through conflict early on. And that's how you be an effective community organizer and community advocate.
Thank you. So moving back to the topic of anti-Asian hate, can you speak to what specific pieces of legislation are working their way through the Assembly and Senate right now, and what those legislation would do if passed?
We have quite a bit. We have a lot on our API legislative caucus bills going through. I don't remember all the numbers because I'm just really bad with numbers. There are literally like thousands of bills in the process right now. But there's a bill about, victim compensation, especially if they are hurt by hate crimes or stuff like that. I believe it's like 898 or something like that. Obviously, there's the hotline issue that we're working on, so to report hate incidences. There's a bunch. We're working on a couple. And then obviously there's education to go to the UCs. That's in the budget right now. It's a couple $1 million, maybe $10 million. Then we have, am I missing any? I don't want to make any of my colleagues mad that I missed bills. But we have a lot. We have a lot of bills going through in every different realm, right? Whether it's like deconstructing racism from certain systems, reporting hate crimes, or education issues. But it's also very important to us that we aren't just doubling down on the old broken criminal justice system. So we also aren't working on those issues. In fact, I have a bill, Assembly Bill 1509, which is basically ending excessively racist sentencing enhancements that really only apply, or really apply to a lot of people of color, because it affects 89 of the people affects 89% of them are people of color.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. If you don't want to paint the Asian American community with such a broad brush, why paint over 200 million white Americans from incredibly diverse backgrounds with the same broad brush? Do you think it is important to recognize the diversity within the white population? And might this movement be guilty of the same mass stereotyping of white people that they abhor within communities of color?
I don't think anyone broad brushes white people as individuals. We have to recognize there's a difference between the country and the history and the privileges that exist in this country. Whether or not you are a very conservative white person or a very liberal woke white person, you still benefit from the same system that holds it, right? Like, it's just the facts of the system, the facts of this country. And I don't think anyone is to say that all white people behave exactly the same. It's just that there are a lot of factors that exist that are similar. And certainly if you recognize in the history of America too, right, the definition of white has changed, right? When South Europeans, East Europeans were not included in that originally. But the idea that, and largely why, I feel like I don't want to get into a debate about this, but largely into like why whiteness has expanded, right? And this concept of whiteness expanded just to uphold uphold its own supremacy and its own power. And you can see this even to this modern day, right, where you have people who are literally wearing swastikas, chanting the 14 words, denying the Holocaust, all this stuff. This still exists today. And this idea of a white nation for white people goes back as far as the beginning, right? And it's this idea of racial purity and that racism that exists very quite uniquely, sharply in a lot of ways in America, as Europe and other countries as well. But we have to recognize that, right? And individual white people also have a role to play in dismantling that. It's not to say they're all guilty of the system that they inherited, but it's certainly that they have to recognize their part in it. Just as the same way you have to recognize that model minority and how the model minority myth and how certain tendencies of assimilation also affect Asian Americans, right? Because there are Asian Americans, I will say this, Asian Americans who accept model minority, who accept assimilation, right? There are people, we probably all know people that do that, but it's important to know that how we can deconstruct those things and recognize that those are all tools of white supremacy. Also, I'll be back in a second. I need to charge my laptop, it's about to die. That's a good question.
So kind of going off of that, how can we as individuals and as a community dismantle white supremacy?
Challenge it. Every day you have to challenge it. Think about what privileges that exists about white supremacy, what is upholding it. And sometimes it's not clear, right? It's not just always some white guy in a Klansman outfit that upholds white supremacy. There are things literally, unfortunately, almost every aspect in society has baked in white supremacy in it, right? Think about how the economic structures uphold white supremacy, how does our judicial system uphold white supremacy, and you have to challenge it, and you see it. And as you learn more about it, I think in the community what's important is you learn more about it, do more reading, just find out resources, because sometimes it'll shock you what was incepted by racism and what is incepted by white things, by white supremacy. Just the more and more we understand it, the more able and ready we are to challenge those things too.
So throughout this event, you've talked about ways institutions and society as a whole can confront racism, especially on the issue of anti-Asian American hate. However, what can we as individuals do, and what final message do you have for us as high schoolers?
Well, final message I always give to people who are especially younger than me is you do not let other people's doubt of you become your doubt. As young people right now in this world, whether you're in high school, college, even before that, you will constantly be plagued with the idea of what is my place in society? How do I fit in? What is my role, right? What is my purpose, essentially? And there will be a lot of people from the outside who are not you, who will question you and question your ability, question your passion, because they'll say you're too young, you're too queer, you're too Asian, you're too whatever, right? And they'll judge you. But you should not let those haters essentially be part of your doubt, because the doubt you have about yourself will always make yourself stronger, even in the moment if it feels really, really terrible to think these thoughts, but it ultimately does. It'll drive you to want to learn more, to do more, and to improve yourself, because the doubts we have a lot of times, especially when we're in new junctures in life, applying to school, applying to new jobs, what have it, is we question our qualifications, what if we fit in society, right? But that always drives us to do more and improve ourselves. And someone always told me about, especially in the realm of politics, very important, is that I think this is very true, especially of people of color, especially of non-men as well, is that there's like a social phenomenon in psychology or something about this too, but it's like there is, especially people of color who are more cognizant of their maybe lack of skills or lack of qualifications, because we aren't all going to be like stellar, know everything once we go to some place to apply for it, but it feels like they want the highest type of candidate. True in politics, right? But you have to remember that we have to walk into every scenario knowing our own passion, but also there are people who certainly have historically benefited from a lot less skills than us, that have just looked like the status quo, who have gotten jobs and stuff a lot easier too. So we have to also have that own confidence about ourselves and not let other people judge ourselves. So that's the important thing. Don't listen to the haters, just listen to yourself.
All right, so thank you so much for your thoughtful responses and for taking the time to speak to the Harker community today. Hopefully this conversation will continue in our own communities. We understand that you're very busy, so thank you again for coming.
It's great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so thank you again, Assemblymember Lee, and thank you to everyone for joining us on the webinar. Have a wonderful rest of the day.